was that they had recently come to the U.S. and that they were radical Islamic jihadists. And as the story evolved and you learned, wow, they came over here, the suspect who's been charged was 9 years old. And then you get senators saying, like Senator Grassley saying, we need to be tougher on immigration. Well, what are you going to do? Ask a 9-year-old if they have a propensity for terrorism? And the younger brother seemed kind of to be following the older brother. If anyone was more radicalized, it seemed like perhaps the older brother was.
Would you consider this a case of domestic terrorism because they've been living in the U.S. for a long time?
I would, in terms of Oklahoma City bombing by Timothy McVeigh was domestic terrorism, but I don't think he was actually charged with anything like weapons of mass destruction, even though he improvised filling a truck with fertilizer and causing far more deaths by an order of magnitude compared to the 3 people that unfortunately died in this incident. So you could call it domestic terrorism, but the charges for McVeigh certainly didn't sound almost like warlike charges.
The U.S. since 9/11 beefed up its spending on security, yet as something as big as the Boston bombings happen. Has the U.S. failed?
I believe this was a massive failure of the surveillance state that we've created in America. Since 9/11, we have spent over $700 billion on national security, and a lot of that is surveillance with video cameras, with massive data collection, with fusion centers, and none of those have helped to deter or detect any terrorist plot. And while the surveillance video was useful in reconstructing what happened after the fact, it didn't prevent it.
Do you think the U.S. will turn to more surveillance? They will increase the surveillance in the U.S. after this attack?
Unfortunately, I think that will be the myopic reaction in America. And not to say why did surveillance fail to detect, but rather to, yes, have even more surveillance, which would be a really unfortunate outcome.
The U.S. seemed divided over the Boston, not over what should happen and how, but over the legality of the procedures. And while some congressmen called to call him as an enemy combatant and to try him as an enemy combatant, others were like, we cannot. There is a Constitution, and we should just uphold the Constitution. Where is this going to take the debate in the U.S., do you think?
You know, we've been having this debate since 9/11. I happen to have been the whistleblower in the case of the American Taliban, John Walker Lindh, and that was a few months after 9/11. And back then, they were talking about whether or not to charge him or call him an enemy combatant or an unlawful belligerent, and whether or not to Mirandize him. I mean, that's what I eventually blew the whistle on, was the fact that they would not let him see his lawyer. And then when they eventually did Mirandize him, they told him, but there are no lawyers here in Afghanistan. So this debate's been going on. I feel like the law is pretty settled that you can't just designate someone, an American in particular, as an enemy combatant and do whatever you want with them. You have to go to court. And I think Padilla's lawyers understood that this was going to eventually end up in court. And that's why they finally allowed him counsel and charged him.
In this case, they allowed him that. Do you think this debate is going maybe to lead to more division in the U.S. over cases like this? Who's going to win such a debate?
Right now, unfortunately, the people who've been dismantling our Constitution and due process rights for defendants and for all American citizens in terms of civil rights and liberties, they're going to be the loser in this case. I think there will be renewed measures in Congress for designating people as enemy combatants and new definitions of terrorism that they're not going to be explicit, by saying, oh, okay, if a Muslim person does it, but they'll say Al-Qaeda and associated forces and anyone connected thereto, or something that makes this so broad it could encompass someone watching a video, which, like I said, I watched it this morning because I wanted to see what video the brother had apparently watched that inspired him to do this, supposedly.
Some people say that this incident and other incidents will probably, the U.S. will witness more Islamophobia. There will be Islamophobia rise in the U.S. post such incidents. Do you agree with them?
Unfortunately, I do, because as you noted from the very beginning, the narrative started to form to place these suspects, one or more, into another camp, and in particular into a terrorist camp. And while the president initially was very careful not to call this an act of terrorism and not to use that word casually, by the next day he was calling it an act of terror. And there started to be rumors about them having come from Chechnya, which is not normally that. It has a large Islamic presence, but is not normally associated with Al-Qaeda. I feel like from the very beginning, there was the best case scenario in a lot of people's minds would to have them be Muslims who had become radicalized and did this as part of jihad. I think that was there from the get-go, and unfortunately, I think this will only increase people's tendencies towards Islamophobia, and that's really unfortunate.
Thank you so much for joining us on RT. Thank you.
Thank you.